Just 20 years ago, this man might have been wearing a jet black military uniform, with a silver skull insignia on his cap, the symbol of the SS, the armed protector of Nazi Germany. Today, he appears as an ordinary citizen, blending into the peaceful life of post-war society. But behind that appearance lies a blood-soaked past, where people who seemed completely ordinary became cogs in a vast machine of genocide. When the Third Reich collapsed in the year 1945, the world believed that justice would finally be carried out and that war criminals would face the consequences. However, reality unfolded in a completely different direction. At its peak, the SS had more than 800,000 members, a staggering number. After the war, only a very small fraction of them were brought to trial, while the vast majority did not disappear from the world, but simply vanished from legal records. There were no dramatic manhunts, no gunfire, no endless series of trials. Instead, there was silence that stretched on for decades. Hundreds of thousands of people who had once served a killing machine melted into the crowd, living ordinary lives as if the past had never existed. The question is, how could those who helped sustain a system of genocide reintegrate into peaceful society without being discovered? How could they become good neighbors, model citizens, living alongside their own victims without anyone knowing? In this video, we do not simply retell the story of those who escaped justice. We will delve into the sophisticated strategies they used to cleanse their identities, create new layers of disguise, and gradually erase the traces of their past in the modern world. Because this is not just the story of individuals on the run. It is a lesson in how history can be manipulated, how black can be turned into white, and how the darkness of the past can find a place in a world struggling to rebuild peace. To understand why more than 800,000 SS members were able to disappear after the war, we need to look at the context immediately following the collapse of the Third Reich. Those once seen as the crime machine of the Nazi regime did not vanish from history as many had hoped. Instead, they actively sought ways to evade legal prosecution and blend into everyday life, largely remaining undetected for many years. Immediately after the year 1945, Europe fell into an unprecedented state of chaos. Millions of people were displaced. Millions of prisoners of war were released, while the Allied authorities struggled to control and rebuild an entire devastated continent. In that sea of humanity, SS members quickly realized a simple truth. Chaos was the perfect opportunity to erase the past. Their most important tactic was identity swapping. In the early post-war period, when document verification systems were still lax, many SS soldiers discarded their own military identification tags and sought to obtain the tags of soldiers who had been killed or gone missing. With just a small piece of metal, they could transform themselves into ordinary soldiers, leaving behind any paper trail linking them to the crimes they had committed. However, there was one trace that was not easy to conceal: the blood group tattoo under the left arm, a distinctive identifying mark of the SS. To remove it, some chose extreme measures. They cut away the skin bearing the tattoo, or burned it with cigarettes to blur the mark. These were painful acts, but for them, it was the price to pay in order to keep living and remain hidden. What is striking is that although many Wehrmacht soldiers, members of Germany's regular army, regarded the SS as unforgivable, almost no one reported them. This silence did not stem from approval of the crimes, but from a deep psychological response after the war. In a shattered society, denouncing former comrades was seen as a betrayal of honor. That silence unintentionally became a protective shield, helping former SS members avoid punishment. This story not only reveals the sophistication of identity cleansing, but also reflects the mindset of a post-war society where silence could sometimes be more powerful than the law. Thanks to this passive cover, those who had caused death and suffering for millions were able to hide, survive in the shadows, and begin new lives as if the past had never existed. For high-ranking SS officers, hiding in prisoner of war camps after the war was only a temporary solution. Sooner or later, their true identities would be discovered. To survive in the long term, they needed a safer path, farther away from Europe, and discreet enough to disappear completely from the sight of justice. These routes were collectively known as the rat lines. They were secret networks designed to move former SS officers out of Europe through Italy or Spain and onward to South America and the Middle East, where they could begin new lives under different identities. When rat lines are mentioned, criticism often focuses on the role of certain individuals in the Vatican, particularly far-right clergy such as Alois Hudal. However, stopping there oversimplifies the picture. In reality, the rat lines were not merely the spontaneous actions of a few individuals, but the result of intersecting interests among multiple forces in a world that had just entered a new order. From the year 1946 onward, the Cold War began to take shape. For many right-wing politicians and clergy in the West, fascism belonged to the past, while communism was seen as the immediate threat. In that context, SS officers, despite being labeled war criminals, were viewed as individuals with combat experience and deep knowledge of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and thus became potential assets in the coming confrontation. For this reason, many former SS members received assistance not because their crimes were approved, but because they were considered useful tools in the fight against communism. Western leaders, especially in the United States and the United Kingdom, chose to set the past aside, accepting that those who had once served the fascist regime would be protected and repurposed within the new geopolitical order. Another crucial link in this escape process came from international humanitarian organizations, especially the International Committee of the Red Cross. In the post-war period, hundreds of thousands of refugees needed documents in order to travel. Due to overload and a lack of personnel, many humanitarian passports were issued without thorough background checks or fingerprint verification. This loophole was exploited by former SS officers. Thanks to these documents, war criminals, such as Adolf Eichmann and Joseph Mengele, were able to leave Europe legally, boarding ships to Argentina as innocent refugees. They were shielded by compassion, placed in the wrong hands, and by remnants of fascist networks that continued to operate quietly after the war. The story of the rat lines shows how global instability can lead to grave misjudgments, not only politically, but morally as well. In a world panicked by new fears, organizations and individuals with originally humanitarian intentions inadvertently became tools that helped war criminals survive, disappear from Europe, and continue to exist in the shadows of history. Modern history forces us to acknowledge a hard truth. At critical moments, justice is not always the highest priority. When the Cold War began, the line between war criminal and intelligence asset quickly became blurred. The great powers were not only competing for geopolitical influence, but were also willing to accept and even protect individuals they had previously vowed to punish severely. After the war, not only concentration camp guards, but also SS officers and Nazi intelligence agencies, especially the security service of the SS, became coveted targets in the silent struggle among the major powers. With spy networks spread across Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, officers of the security service held a trove of information that American intelligence, then known as the Office of Strategic Services, could not ignore. As fear of communism spread, the value of information began to outweigh questions of moral responsibility. Justice was therefore postponed in exchange for security. Many who should have stood before a courtroom were instead brought into secret cooperation programs. A prominent example is Reinhard Gehlen, a German intelligence general responsible for the Eastern Front. Instead of being arrested and tried, Gehlen was protected by the United States and allowed to establish his own intelligence network, recruiting hundreds of former SS and Gestapo officers. This network later became the foundation of what is now Germany's Federal Intelligence Service. Another example, even more controversial, is Klaus Barbie, known as the Butcher of Lyon. Barbie was responsible for the death and torture of thousands of people. Yet, instead of being punished, he was sheltered by American intelligence, helped to escape to Bolivia, and continued to provide anti-communist intelligence. For strategists at the time, Barbie's criminal past was seen as a price worth paying for strategic gain. Many historians have described these decisions as a deal with the devil. During the most tense years of the Cold War, morality no longer occupied a central place. Faced with the fear of nuclear war and the expansion of the Soviet Union, the great powers chose to use the enemy of their enemy, turning war criminals into tools in the service of national security goals. The result was that countless war criminals were granted a second life, living in the shadows, protected by the very nations that had once proclaimed their pursuit of justice. These decisions reveal a cold reality of international politics. In major confrontations, the survival of the state can drive people toward choices that defy morality, accepting those who caused immense suffering in exchange for a sense of security in an uncertain world. 5. The whitewashing strategy of the Waffen-SS. While some SS members fled to South America and others quietly worked for intelligence agencies, the majority of former Waffen-SS veterans remained in Germany. They did not disappear, nor did they live in hiding. Instead, they sought ways to return to society, reintegrating into post-war life as ordinary citizens. But a new identity was not enough. To truly survive, they needed a new story, a reinterpretation of the past, convincing enough for society to accept. Out of this need, in the early 1950s, the organization HIAG was founded by former Waffen-SS members. HIAG's goal was clear: to cleanse the public image of the Waffen-SS. Their central tactic was distilled into a simple message: the Waffen-SS were just soldiers like any others. HIAG did not completely deny the crimes of the Nazi regime, but they deliberately separated those crimes from most of the Waffen-SS. In their narrative, only the concentration camp guard units, the Totenkopf units, were the real perpetrators, while the Waffen-SS were merely elite soldiers, fighting on the battlefield like any other army. This distinction was deceptive, yet highly effective. By portraying themselves as victims of historical generalization, HIAG gradually constructed a new narrative in which former Waffen-SS veterans were not criminals, but soldiers unfairly treated after the war. This story convinced public opinion, and more importantly, it convinced the West German government. As a result, many former Waffen-SS members were granted the same rights as other veterans, including state-funded pensions. From individuals who had once served a machine of genocide, they were redefined as legitimate citizens of the new Germany. This acceptance was not accidental. In West Germany of the 1950s, under Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, the country faced the enormous task of reconstruction. Thoroughly prosecuting roughly 800,000 former SS members was not only administratively impossible, but also carried the risk of severe social instability. Faced with this choice, the authorities placed stability and the future above absolute justice. From this point on, an unspoken agreement took shape in West German society. Do not ask too deeply about the past, so that a future could be built together. Former SS members were not only tolerated, but many even returned to the state apparatus, becoming police officers, judges, and politicians. Justice did not disappear, but it was pushed into the background. This way of confronting the past created a paradox that lasted for decades. Social stability and reconstruction were achieved, but the price was that grave crimes were never fully addressed. The narratives constructed to help war criminals reintegrate left deep marks on the collective psyche and political life of West Germany, a moral blind spot that would only be seriously questioned many years later. That silence did not last forever. As the generation born after the war came of age, unavoidable questions began to surface. By the late 1960s, Germany entered a deep identity crisis, as young people confronted their own family histories for the first time. A chilling question echoed in many homes. What did my father do during the war? This question was not aimed only at individuals, but directly at the long silence of an entire society. After years focused on reconstruction and stability, Germany was forced to face an undeniable truth. The past of the fascist regime could not be buried forever. Crimes that had occurred did not vanish simply because people stopped talking about them. Yet, as many perpetrators had grown old or passed away, justice could no longer be carried out in the traditional sense. Instead, justice gradually took on a different form: the affirmation of responsibility and the acknowledgement of historical truth. This became especially visible in the late trials held decades after the war. In the 2010s, the world paid close attention to cases involving very elderly defendants, such as Oskar Groening, often referred to as the accountant of Auschwitz. The purpose of these trials was not revenge, but to dismantle a justification that had endured for years. I was just following orders. German courts introduced a landmark principle. If you contributed to the functioning of a machine of genocide, you were responsible. You did not need to kill anyone directly. You did not need to pull the trigger. If you stood guard, kept records, or ensured the system kept running, you were part of the crime. Even in the most extreme circumstances, individual moral responsibility still exists, and it cannot be erased by orders. This late awakening became a warning far beyond Germany's borders. It reminds us that justice can be delayed by political interests, obscured by sophisticated whitewashing campaigns. But historical truth cannot be completely erased. No matter how long it takes, history always finds a way to bring the truth back into the light. And in the end, every crime must face responsibility for itself. The fate of more than 800,000 SS members after the year 1945 is a maze of betrayal, compromise, and family secrets buried deep beneath the quiet towns of post-war Europe. They did not disappear from the world. They merely changed form in order to continue existing within a new order, where the past was pushed into silence. This story is not only about how war criminals escaped justice. It raises a larger question about human nature and how societies confront their own past. After the year 1945, the world faced a painful choice: to pursue justice to the very end, or to accept compromise in order to preserve social stability and strategic interests within a new global order. For many leaders at the time, the threat of the Cold War and communism was seen as the highest priority. In that context, overlooking the past of war criminals was considered a form of strategic pragmatism. But that pragmatism also left a moral stain that stretched across generations. Do we have the right to judge those decisions when they had to choose between punishing the past and protecting the future? Or is it precisely the refusal to judge that is most dangerous, because it allows moral failures to be repeated under different names? If justice can be delayed for political interests, does it truly exist? And if the world were to fall into crisis once again, would we act differently? Or would we once more choose silence for necessary reasons? Share your perspective in the comments. Different viewpoints are how we continue a dialogue with history rather than turning our backs on it. If you want to explore more deeply how the process of denazification actually unfolded, why it is seen as both a monumental effort and a deeply flawed one, continue following the channel. Do not forget to like and subscribe so you do not miss future in-depth historical analyses. Thank you for being with us.